Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to our second topic for this week in World Civilizations 2. As I said, for the rest of the semester, essentially, we're going to talk about how the fall of the Soviet Union and the post-Cold War world has essentially led into what we know, or the world we see today. Now, in evidence of my never-ending mercy, we do have a relatively short one for you. I do have a very relatively short one for you today, if I can ever learn to speak proper human English. So, what we're going to do mainly is sort of talk about what I alluded to at the end of the last lesson, which is what's going to happen to some of the old Soviet Union stuff. One of the things that has led to is what many political scientists and historians call today the age of terrorism following the end of the Soviet Union. So to do that, we're just going to really talk about three main things. We're going to look at some of the terrorist groups that the USSR was recorded as backing. We're going to look at the rise of Al-Qaeda, and we're going to talk about some Iranian-sponsored terrorism. Now, before I really get into any of this content, I do want to be clear that this is no way attempting to single out Islamic terrorism, single out Islam, or anything of that nature. As you hopefully all know by now, I'm not going to pick any horse in this class or when it comes to religion, but so I just want to be very clear that it's in no way intended to single out anyone. We are going to talk about examples of Christian terrorist groups actually a little bit later in the semester. But for reasons I'll get into, the Soviet Union primarily backed or was influential in groups that would end up becoming Islamic terrorist groups. So it is important to focus on. That spiel might not have been necessary, and I do apologize if it bored anyone, but I do just always like to make sure in all my classes that everyone knows that I'm not taking any sides when it comes to religious debates. But anyway, let's jump into the dates we have for the rest of the semester, the rest of the couple of weeks. I'm getting ahead of myself. I already went over these in my last lesson, so I won't talk about them very much. But do again, just be aware of all these dates here. Let me know if you have any questions about where to find this stuff, where to turn it in, what I expect, or anything like that. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and talk about terrorism a little bit, which is not really a sentence I ever thought I'd say, but here we are. Now, I did want to focus a little bit today on some of the groups that the USSR is known to have supported, because I feel like so far I've been very hard on what America did that was unethical during the Cold War. So I do want to be aware that the USSR was up to definitely at the very least questionable things as well. Now, it is recorded and pretty common knowledge among governments at this point that the Soviet Union did support a few terrorist groups throughout the 60s and 70s, especially before its downfall that we talked about last week. For example, one terrorist group was active in East Germany called the Red Army Faction and the Second June Movement. These were left-wing, anti-imperial, and capitalist groups that were also pro-Palestinian. We're going to talk about the whole Palestine and Israeli divide a little bit later in the semester, but I'm sure some of you already know that the Arab and Israeli divide historically has been very strong. So part of the controversy here was that the USSR was typically taking the side of groups that were against Israel. These groups were no exception. These groups have been implicated in bombings, kidnappings, bank robberies, and even political assassinations. So they are, of course, up to very horrible things as well. There's also the Red Brigades that were active in Italy, which were a revolutionary far-left organization. This group was known to participate in assassinations, most notably a former prime minister of the country, and also were involved in bank robberies. Gotta finance yourself somehow, right? Also, the Soviet government supported the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was located primarily in Palestine and throughout areas of the Middle East. This, of course, would be an anti-Israeli liberation group. Now, like I said again, we're going to talk about that conflict a little bit later in the semester, hopefully in just a week or two, really. But just to give you a very brief outline, after World War II, Israel, the country of Israel, was established in the middle of Arabic territory. As you might imagine, many Muslim countries in the area were not huge fans of this. This group was known for being involved in plane hijackings. This was actually so prevalent that later, General Alexander Sarkovsky, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, a former KGB chief director, claimed, "Airplane hijacking is my own invention." Now, why is that so significant? Yeah, very good. Those of you watching at home, this deals with much more recent history. It is at the very least arguable that the USSR did help support terrorist groups who would eventually form into the groups responsible for attacks like 9/11, or at least carried out very similar attacks involving plane hijackings. Many of these Islamic terrorist groups that practiced plane hijackings were trained and or supported by the USSR. Now, the problem for us is what's going to happen to these groups when the USSR falls. For example, again, in more recent history, what happened to Iraq after the United States largely left Iraq? Very good. Those of you especially were paying attention in last lesson about the fall of the Soviet Union, just like those groups those countries that used to be controlled by the Soviet Union, these terrorist groups are essentially going to be able to strike out on their own now and carry out more of their own agendas rather than the USSR's. So essentially, historians and political science have argued that we're now in the age of terrorism, quote unquote, because the Soviet Union is no longer around to control these various groups. Now, by the way, this is obviously, as you might have guessed, the Red Army faction logo, and this is the logo of the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, because of this, after the Soviet Union fell, most terrorist groups, or at least that were identified by the United Nations, were groups that were revolutionary, Marxist, nationalist, or separatist. Now, I probably already gave this away, but why would this be the case? Why would most of these terrorist groups be revolutionary and Marxist? Okay, again, like I said, I'll give you a pretty short pause on that one, because I kind of gave that one away already. It's because, again, these groups were all originally backed by the USSR. So although, as you can see, especially with some of these Palestinian organizations, they have their own agendas, but they're all being backed by the USSR, so they have to follow their wishes to a certain extent, at the very least. Now, since 1991, it is argued by the United Nations that most terrorist groups are religious-based. Do you have any idea of this change? Between 2 out of the 64 recognized terrorist groups by the United Nations were classified as religious in 1980. By 1995, it was 25 out of 58. Again, I already gave this away, but this has essentially been changed because the Soviet Union is not the motivating ideology or backing behind terrorism anymore. So now various groups with religious causes are essentially coming in to fill the vacuum. Now again, one thing you might have noticed that I said is that these are the groups that are recognized by the United Nations. Why might that be a little problematic that it's the United Nations who's deciding who the terrorist groups are? Bit of a tough question, isn't it? Fun day. But yes, as you might imagine, it could show a little bit of bias, you could argue, and some people do argue. Now, I do want to be clear that I would in no way, shape, or form want to defend any of these groups, obviously. But as we've talked about a little bit already in this class, and as you've seen in various lectures, the United States and Western powers have also supported questionable organizations, but these were not usually classified as terrorist groups by the United Nations. So again, it is important to recognize that groups that are classified by terrorist organizations by the United Nations could occasionally have a bit of bias. I would not want to defend personally any of these groups that are classified as terrorist groups, but it is important to recognize again that the USSR was not alone in supporting groups like this. Speaking of which, the birth of Al-Qaeda is of course very closely related to the United States, as we talked about a little while ago. For example, Al-Qaeda arguably got its best start with Operation Cyclone. As we talked about a little bit, Operation Cyclone was when the United States wanted to support Mujahideen warriors fighting against the Soviet Union invasion. Approximately $600 million in U.S. aid was sent to Gulag, I'm not even trying to butcher the pronunciation, I don't want to be that disrespectful. So again, this was meant to support rebels fighting against the Soviet-backed government. Now, this would also obviously suggest that we had a pretty close relationship with these groups, but this did eventually start to go sour. For example, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, King Fahd allowed U.S. troops to defend the area instead of allowing Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen to lead the defense. He was particularly upset because U.S. troops were being allowed to settle or to base in Mecca and Medina. Now, This might be a little bit, this is before any of the history we've discussed really so far, but can anyone tell me why Muslims like Osama bin Laden would be upset that U.S. troops are being allowed in these areas? Eventually I'll get good at talking, I swear. But yeah, for those of you who know a little bit about global religions, Mecca and Medina are actually very holy cities in the Islamic faith. Mecca is believed to be where the Prophet Muhammad originally came from, and where Abraham and his son Ishmael sought to make an altar to Allah or to God at one point. Medina is where Islam is believed to have been founded and where Muhammad set up his first government. So these are essentially, again, very holy cities in the Islamic faith, and typically don't allow non-Muslims to settle there. So obviously, a very devout Muslim like Osama bin Laden is going to be upset by this. His protests were actually so extensive that he was exiled by the Saudi government. By 1996, he was eventually given refuge by the Taliban government that was set up in Afghanistan at the time. This is important because this is where the planning for the September 11 attacks took place. Now, a couple of questions to keep in mind. How does Al-Qaeda demonstrate the lasting effects of the Cold War? And what do you think might have happened to other militant groups backed by the U.S.? Very good. Again, viewers watching at home, you might have noticed that this is very similar, again, to what I was talking about with the USSR-backed terrorist groups. Now that the motivation of the Cold War is over, and global powers are getting up to other problems that might offend various organizations and people, the motivation of these groups is going to change, and they might eventually turn back and turn against the people who used to support them, but they can still use this support in order to carry out all of their violence and all their ideologies. This also happened to other groups backed by the U.S. and the USSR, some of which we will talk about. Now again, this does obviously demonstrate that it is very difficult to chart who is to blame for the rise of Al-Qaeda. Obviously, they are all responsible for their own decisions, but what role does the U.S. have due to their initial support of these groups? What role does the USSR have in their initial support of these organizations that eventually broke off and did their own thing? It shows that I think it shows that the lasting influence of the Cold War can really still be seen with us today. All the conflicts that the Cold War started and all the organizations that the Cold War supported, many of them, or at least some form of them, are still around today. For example, Iranian-sponsored terrorism is still an issue, which we will, again, talk about a little bit more in the coming weeks. For example, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was formed in 1979, which was intended to promote Iran's social policies. About 100,000 troops and 20,000 naval troops were present in this organization at its height. Now, why do you think this group was founded, by the way, in 1979? What did that have to do with the Cold War? Very good. This is obviously in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, when Iran threw off the US-backed government and set up their own Islamic government. Very common theme if you haven't noticed. Hezbollah was formed in 1982, which is a Lebanon group protesting Israeli occupation in the area. The organization of Hamas was founded in 1987 with the stated goal to liberate Palestine from Israel. The Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine was formed in 1984, which had the same goal as Hamas, obviously. Many of these groups, to give a little wider context, many of these groups have also been sponsored by Syria at various points, and Pakistan has also been accused as being, with the possible exception of Iran, perhaps the world's most active sponsor of terrorist groups. Now, what is a common theme of these groups, and how is that going to affect their relationship with the U.S.? Very good again, viewers at home, as I finish stroking my beard again like a James Bond villain. Israel is essentially the common denominator with all of these groups. Many of these groups in the Middle East especially are being formed to protest what they see as Israeli occupation of their land. This is one of the major reasons these groups typically have such a horrible relationship with the United States, is that, as many of you know, the United States historically has supported Israel ever since their founding. So as we're going to talk about in the next couple of weeks, This leads to a very problematic relationship between groups like this and various Middle Eastern countries to the United States. Now, one thing I would like to focus on just for a second to give us a bit more of a positive outlook is how potentially we can fight terrorism. In an article from The Atlantic in 2011, it stated, "The lesson of Soviet-sponsored terrorism and its end is that if the world is to defeat Islamist terrorism, it will have to defeat the motivating narrative. In the same way that communism became a bankrupt ideology, the political philosophy underpinning terrorism needs to be challenged, exposed, and ridiculed." So, how do we essentially defeat the motivating narrative of modern terrorism, and what is maybe the best way to protect the world from future attacks and future violence? Because, as the article stated, once communism fell apart, that essential motivation, if I can find where I was, that essential motivation ended communist terrorism because there was no motivating ideology to back them up anymore. So essentially, what this article is arguing we need to do is defeat the logic and the propaganda of Islamic terrorism, which I think is summed up very well here by Malala, if I could say her name right, Yousafzai. I actually really do hate if I butchered her name because she's one of my favorite people in the whole world. She said at one point, with guns you can kill terrorists, and with education you can kill terrorism. Bit of background on her, she's actually a very famous education activist in Afghanistan who advocates for education for women and the increasing of women's rights under Islamic law. Very wonderful person. I recommend you all read up about her. But essentially, as you could guess, this is not a question we're all going to solve overnight, or probably even really solve in this class. But I do think that's one of the main reasons I do support education, is acknowledging the historical complexities and motivations of groups like this is really the best way we have to discredit them and end potential violence without going out and just killing everybody, which obviously I'm not going to be a huge fan of. But anyway, let me know if you have any other suggestions or any other ideas. But in the meantime, that's all I have for you today. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you all again at some point in the future. Have a good one.